Your SAP system is running on Azure, but now you need to devise a process to ensure how SAP users, admins, or various teams actually get access. In our last video, we explored the capabilities of Microsoft Entra and Active Directory domain services. In this video, let's connect those dots and let's understand both of these services in more detail. Let's also look into how we perform all these integrations. It's going to be a very interesting video, so stick around. In this deep dive, we will uncover how identity integrations work in the real world, syncing Entra ID with SAP Cloud Platform Identity Authentication, using ADDS and Entra domain services to centralize identity, and integrating Linux-based SAP systems with AD securely and efficiently. Welcome back to AZ-120 SAP Workloads on Azure series, and in this series we are exploring foundations of identity and governance for SAP on Azure, and in this video we will talk about identity and governance integrations part 2 for SAP on Azure. If you are new here, my name is Rajdeep. I am a Microsoft certified trainer and a solution architect, helping clients build amazing solutions every day. And we are on a mission to make learning fun as well as crack certifications in that process. Topic 1. Integrations with Entra. Now, we have explored foundations of authorization and authentication in our last video, which is linked above, and how using SSO and MFA, you can make your SAP environment more secure and provide a better user experience. Let's discuss on the various integration options now. This is also important from the exam perspective. These integrations work on the principle of creating trust relationship between Microsoft Entra and various SAP identity platforms and SaaS products. Let's look into our first integration, which is Microsoft Entra ID with SAP Cloud Platform Identity Authentication. Before we dive into the integration, let's understand what are the benefits of doing that. You can add users to Entra ID and in turn control which of those users can have access to SAP Cloud Platform Identity Authentication. Users get a seamless experience of logging into SAP Cloud Platform Identity Authentication with their Microsoft Entra account. You can also manage your account in one central location. Now that we have understood the why, let's go to the portal and see how it is done. So in the Azure portal, we will go to the Microsoft Entra ID, and then we will go to Enterprise Applications Blade on the left hand side. Here, if you click on New Application and just type in SAP Cloud Platform, it will come up with an option of adding SAP Cloud Platform Identity Authentication Service. Similarly, you can also find this integration for Fiori as well as for NetWeaver. Now what I have done is I have already added an SAP Cloud Platform Identity application, and I'll go and check the single sign-on blade here. Now here you can see there is a SAML option. Now we already discussed about SAML in our previous videos. If you click on SAML, it'll ask you to provide the SAML configuration. Now of course, the identifier, entity ID, reply URL and single sign-on URL are something which you need to collect from the SAP support team. We do not have an SAP environment, so we cannot go ahead and demo this, but this is the place essentially from where you can go ahead and configure your SAML configurations to enable SSO. You can also add users here. You can click on add users, or you can add a group of users so that these group of users have access to your SAP application via your Entra ID. So you see, it's very easy to integrate SAP applications with Entra and control the authentication and authorization to your SAP applications via your Entra ID. The process remains same for Fiori and NetWeaver. Topic 2. Active Directory domain services. Let's try to have a bit more understanding on ADDS. We touched upon it in our last video and which scenarios it might be used in our SAP on Azure landscape. ADDS, aka Active Directory Domain Services, in principle is an identity and access management solution which is used on premises as well as suited for isolated environment. Now the way ADDS handles authentication is via domain member concept, which works in the following way. Say you work for a company, say the name of the company is .local, and you have a laptop which needs access to the shared resources and centralized management. You take your laptop to your IT administrator and he or she joins your machine to the domain. Now this process is called domain joining. After you domain join, you can log into the laptop and your credentials are managed by the good old AD server, which is also called the domain controller, since it controls the domain. And your laptop is now part of the domain and you can access files and folders and all the shared resources which are available in the company. Now that's all fine in the foreground. But what actually happens in the background? The protocol which comes into play in this particular case is called LDAP, or Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. It is mainly used for directory related services, for example, looking for a printer or looking for a group of users or user on a network. Kerberos and SMB, or server messaging block, is a protocol mainly used for authentication. Don't worry if you don't know what Kerberos is. We will discuss that in detail in our preceding slides. Now that we understand ADDS, let us explore when is it used in our SAP environment. Say that you have all your SAP estate in cloud, which mainly consists of VMs. How do you authenticate the users with the VM and SAP application? Well, what you can do is you create an ADDS server and set up Active Directory domain services. Now, when you do that, what you're actually creating is a forest. Now, this is a new forest and can authenticate your VM logins as well as your Azure VM resident SAP applications using Kerberos. Now that's all fine when you have everything inside the Azure estate. What if you have a hybrid environment? What is a hybrid deployment? Say some of your SAP estate is in cloud and some is in on-premises. This is what hybrid deployment is. Now say you have an hybrid deployment and you have existing on-prem AD deployment and you want to extend your on-prem Active Directory to Azure. So your ADDS server remains on-prem and you create a connectivity between on-prem and Azure. All your VMs and resident SAP applications come back to on-premises for authentication and authorization. But there is one thing which you need to note and remember. There is something called latency which you need to tackle, which means traffic from Azure to on-prem may not be as fast as you desire. Why is that? Apart from authentication traffic, there will be a lot of other traffic which will be moving in. Think of it like driving on a highway with a lot of traffic. Your authentication and authorization is the car you're driving, and this may get impacted when you use this setup. In order to mitigate that latency issue, you could go for ADDS servers on Azure as well as on-premises. Existing on-premises deployment has ADDS. Well, you put additional domain controllers in Azure. This is an ideal setup when your Azure traffic does not need to go to on-prem for authentication and all the authentication is handled in Azure. So essentially you localize your authentication traffic. You might deploy RODC or read-only domain controllers in Azure so that your original AD on-prem is protected and the VMs which are in Azure get all the authentication requirements met locally in Azure. But there is a problem of having ADDS services in cloud. You need to spin up additional virtual machines, primary and secondary domain controllers, and that would create an extra overhead on your IT teams because they have to think about patching and managing the server and monitoring them. This problem brings us to our next topic. Before that, if you like the channel, consider subscribing, liking and commenting on the video. Don't feel shy. I'm always listening and I will try to incorporate any of your comments or suggestions in my next videos. Let's get back. Topic 3. Microsoft Entra Domain Services. Now before we talk about Microsoft Entra Domain Services, let us not confuse this with Entra ID. Let us reiterate the difference between them. Microsoft Entra ID and Microsoft Entra Domain Services. Microsoft Entra ID, formerly known as Azure AD, while Microsoft Entra Domain Services is Entra Domain Services. Entra is also called Entra DS. What is the purpose of Entra ID? Entra ID provides cloud-based identity and access management. Entra Domain Services provides managed domain services for legacy compatibility. What are the main use cases of Entra ID? Entra ID authenticates users to SaaS apps, cloud services, and modern applications, while Entra Domain Services primarily supports legacy applications and VMs that require traditional domain protocols like LDAP, Kerberos, and TLM. Which brings us to what are the protocols which are supported in Entra ID and Entra Domain Services respectively. So in Entra ID, it supports all your modern protocols, which is OAuth, SAML, OpenID Connect, while your Entra Domain Services supports all traditional protocols like LDAP, Kerberos, NTLM, group policies. In Entra Domain Services, you have a concept of domain controllers, while in Entra ID, there is no domain controllers. It's a fully cloud managed service. Now, interestingly, in Microsoft Entra Domain Services, the domain controllers are there, but you do not have to create it on a virtual machine. It is provided as a service. As we discussed in the previous slide, whenever you want to spin up domain services, you need to create specific extra virtual machines. Now, Entra Domain Services specifically addresses that problem, which means deploy this service in Azure and all the underlying virtual machines and deployment of AD on the virtual machines will be taken care of by Microsoft. You just use the service as you would use a normal domain controller. We will quickly look into the Azure portal and see how it is done. Let's quickly head to our Azure portal and check out Entra Domain Services. So I am in the Azure portal already. In the resources, Microsoft Entra Domain Services. So you can see it pops up here. You click on it and there's an option to create it. Click on create. Now notice when you click on create, it will ask you to create a resource group because this is a resource. It needs to be placed inside a resource group. So I'll click on create and I'll just say Entra DSRG, which denotes Entra Domain Services Resource Group. You can give any name which you want. The DNS name tells what would be the domain of the domain services which will be deployed. I'll keep it default as of now. Region, I'm selecting UK South. You can select any region which you want. SKU, we are just doing it for testing purposes, so I'll just keep it standard. I'll click on next. Now notice it'll ask you to provide a virtual network here. If you do not provide a virtual network, it will create it itself. So I'll allow it to create a virtual network itself. But what this essentially does, it places the domain controller service in a virtual network and in a specific subnet. Just to keep this in mind before you deploy the domain services. Now click on next and keep everything default and click on next. So here you can see there is a synchronization type which says all or cloud only, based on if you want to sync back to on-prem or you want cloud only deployment. So basically this kind of synchronization tells the domain controller service that do you want to sync back to your on-premises to pick up data, or you are a cloud only organization. So I have kept it cloud only. Click on next. So next it will ask you to select the TLS mode. You can see the TLS mode by default is 1.2, which is the security protocol which takes care of securing data when it travels between the computers. That's what you see when you open a secured website, a padlock, which means that the connection is secured by TLS 1.2. You cannot disable this, it's by default enabled. Next you can see NTLM. Now this one is an older protocol used to verify the identity of the users and computers, and you have to enable this in case you want to have a compatibility to NTLM related to authentications in your environment. The Kerberos we already discussed earlier as an authentication protocol. This one has a strong encryption and a ticket-based authentication, and hence it's widely used. So you can click on it and enable this. Next you have LDAP. Now this is, as discussed earlier, lightweight directory access protocol, and you also have password synchronization from on-premises. This feature helps you synchronize passwords from different services, for example from Microsoft Entra Domain Services to Entra ID or any other systems which might be storing your username or password in form of a hash. So we'll click on next, and it's validating, and if you click on create, it will go ahead and create the Microsoft Entra Domain Services, your fully managed domain controllers. So we have seen how Microsoft Entra Domain Services are deployed. To the last point, which is the use case for this particular service. So use case for Entra ID is organizations which use cloud native or modern applications. While you still need Microsoft Entra domain services, if you are an organization who has recently migrated, or you are migrating legacy directory aware applications onto Azure. Now, all this is fine. We are talking about Windows VM authentications up until now. However, our old friend Linux is also a part of SAP estate. How do you enable authentication and authorization for those systems? Let's try to explore what we can do about Linux operating systems. Which brings us to the next topic: integrate Linux with Entra ID domain services. Linux systems or virtual machines which contain Linux operating systems can also be integrated with Microsoft Entra domain services. How? Linux supports three options of doing that. The first one is LDAP, lightweight directory access protocol. So we can use LDAP for authentication and authorization. Interestingly, the applications which use name service switch and pluggable authentication module can use LDAP module to communicate with LDAP endpoints of Active Directory. What is name services switch and pluggable authentication module? Let's understand. Name services switch is a system in Unix-like operating system that controls how programs look up various types of system information like user accounts, groups, and host names. If you have an application which does not have an inbuilt authentication authorization module, Linux and Unix-like OS provide this feature, pluggable authentication module. This feature, pluggable authentication module, acts as a bridge between applications. In LDAP authentication for Linux, LDAP users cannot change their password from Linux client. Now that's a drawback. The second way is Kerberos authentication. Now let's try to understand Kerberos authentication and how it works. Till now we know that Kerberos authentication works on a ticket-based system or a ticket-based protocol, which is used to prove the identity of the user. But how does it actually work? Let's make it simple by breaking it down in steps. Step 1. The user requests authentication by entering the credentials. This request is then sent to the authentication server. This authentication server is part of a key distribution center, KDC. The authentication server checks the user's credential against its own database. If it finds a match, it sends back a ticket granting ticket, TGT. Now note, this TGT is encrypted, which can only be read by a special server called ticket granting server. The user has requested access to a service. Now this TGT, which was with the user, is sent to TGS. Now suppose the user requests access to the service. This TGT, which was with the user, is sent to the TGS, which in turn verifies the TGT. You might think that the user has been granted access to the application now, but no, there is more. TGS then issues a service ticket. This ticket is encrypted with the service secret key and the session key. Finally, the client takes this service key and presents it to the target service, which is your application. And if everything checks out, user is granted access to the service. Phew. Now we understand how Kerberos works. Now coming back to Linux authentication using Kerberos, pluggable authentication module uses PAM KRB5 module, which is your Kerberos 5 module. This module sends users' credentials to Kerberos key distribution center, in this case Active Directory, and gets the authentication ticket. This ticket helps users to get access to the secured service. This integration is supported out of the box, hence it is a popular configuration. The third way is the Winbind authentication. Now, those who are familiar with Linux might know about Samba suite. For those who are not, put it simply, the suite helps Linux and Unix-like systems to integrate with Windows AD environment. Now, Winbind runs as a background daemon, or you can say a service. Interestingly, the Winbind emulates the Windows client, and hence AD thinks that client, even though it's a Linux system, is a Windows system. This enables Winbind to act as a bridge between Linux systems and AD servers. If you're logging into Linux machine, it can be done with your Windows credentials. Now that brings us to the end of the topic. So there you are, real world identity integration that brings your SAP on Azure environment to life. From Entra ID's seamless access to cloud apps to Active Directory's power in hybrid and legacy system to extending the same control in Linux. These are more than just configuration. They are your defense mechanisms and efficiency boosters. Whether you are an architect designing secure solutions or just a candidate aiming for AZ-120 exam, mastering these integrations is non-negotiable. If this helped connect the dots, give the video a thumbs up, drop your questions in the comment, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell icon. This helps the channel grow and also motivates me to create more such content. We have got more deep dives coming your way.